Okay, so now that we've given everyone a bit of a chance to show up, we're going to get started. So hello everyone, thank you all so much for joining us here tonight for what I'm sure is going to be a wonderful evening. I would like to officially welcome you all to the second event of the Bloody Ringwood 2020 Festival. Tonight, Ringwood Publishing are incredibly excited to be launching Rob McInroy's thrilling new true crime novel, Cuddies Strip. We are joined tonight by the author himself and a very special guest, Cuddy Unsworth. Cuddy is a critically acclaimed editor, writer, and novelist. Cuddy has also appeared on television and radio, including reviewing for BBC Two's The Culture Show, and we're delighted to have her here with us tonight to help host the event.
Thank you.
Before we get into the good stuff, I would firstly like to just quickly run you through the shape of the evening. So after introductions have been made, Rob will treat us to some exclusive readings from the book and answer some of Cuddy's own questions. From there, Cuddy will open up the floor to audience questions in a live Q&A. If you wish to submit a question for the Q&A, you can do so at any time in the chat box of the Zoom webinar, in the comment section of the Facebook live stream, or alternatively, you can tweet us at Ringwood Publish. Most importantly though, before we begin, I would like to just take this opportunity on behalf of everyone here at Ringwood Publishing to say how incredibly thrilled we are to be publishing Cuddy Strip. Cuddy Strip is a brilliant novel with a fascinating subject and truly memorable characters. The writing is gripping, and at times it is genuinely difficult to believe that this isn't pure fiction and that there is so much truth in this story. Indeed, this is a harrowing story that Ringwood Publishing believes truly deserves to be told, and myself and everyone else at Ringwood would like to just kind of offer our greatest thanks to Rob for choosing Ringwood and for allowing us to help him tell this story. We are incredibly proud to be publishing such a wonderful work of fiction. If anyone watching in the audience at home would like to purchase their own copy of Cuddy Strip after the event, just head to the bookshop section of the Ringwood Publishing website, where Cuddy Strip can be found under fiction. You can also purchase an ebook version of the book for your Kindle through Amazon. So with all that said and done then, I'll now hand over to the man of the hour, Rob McInroy, so that he can tell us a little bit about himself and the book in his own words. Take it away, Rob.
Hey, thank you very much, Megan, and welcome to everybody, and cheers. I hope you've all come suitably refreshed for the occasion. So as Megan said, my name's Rob McInroy and I'm the author of Cuddy Strip, and my co-host this evening is the fabulous Cuddy Unsworth. So I'll be handing over to her in a minute, and in between some readings from me, Cuddy's going to be asking some questions. There'll be her questions, and then at the end some questions from you in the audience. Just first of all, to give you a little bit of background about Cuddy Strip, it's a novel I actually never really meant to write. It came kind of out of the blue to me, really. I was already working on a trilogy back in 2017. I'd completed one novel called Cloudland, which is based in Crieff, my hometown Crieff, in 1985. And I was about 20,000 words into my second novel, which is based in Perth, also in 1985. That one was called Lost Land. And there would be a third, and there will at some stage be a third in the trilogy, which will be The Prodigals returning in 2014, and specifically around May 17th, 2014. And some of you in the audience will immediately recognize the significance of that date. So that's what I was working on. But then I came across this story, and I came across it. I'm a St Johnstone supporter for my sins, and there's a website called We Are Perth, which is where all of us St Johnstone fans gather together to mourn on a Saturday afternoon when we've lost 2-0 to Livingston, and so on. And there's a section in the We Are Perth forum for people to post old pictures of Perthshire. And one time back in 2017, somebody posted a picture of a funeral cortege, and hundreds of people lining Perth as his funeral cortege went by with the hearse and the coffin and flowers surrounding it. And the poster said, "This is seems to be a really sad story. A boy was murdered in Perth in 1935." And I didn't know anything about it. So I started doing some research on it. I started looking on the web and found out the story of the Cuddy Strip murder and rape. And I got really, really interested in it. So I went on to the newspaper archive website and I read all the contemporary newspaper reports from the day. And the story just really came to life for me. And in particular, what emerged for me was the treatment of the young woman in the story, Marjorie Fenwick, how she was treated by the authorities, from the police who investigated through to the trial and even the trial judge. So I got really into it. I did a lot more research. I went to the National Records of Scotland and looked up the trial materials, and they kind of told an even more desperate story. They included things like all the medical reports and all the reports that were submitted for the Crown case. And that really began to show the level of misogyny, really, that Marjorie had to put up with in the course of the investigation and the subsequent trial. Her word was called into question, and frankly, even her reputation was called into question. And it was just a story that I absolutely felt I had to write. I was just really enraged, I've got to be honest, about the way she was treated. I felt I had to try and bring this story to life. So I put the trilogy aside for the duration, and I started working on this story. And now that it's complete and it's published, I'm still looking at 1930s, because I think I've still got unfinished business in the 1930s that I need to return to. But in the course of time, I will be getting back to my trilogy and rounding that off. So that's sort of the genesis of the book. That's how it all came about. And at this point, I'd like to just bring in Cathy Unsworth.
No.
Cathy, hello. Cathy is the author of Weirdo, Without the Moon, That Old Black Magic, some other great novels, including the soon-to-be republished Bad Penny Blues. So, Cathy, welcome, and thank you very much for being here with me tonight.
Oh, Rob, thank you. It's my absolute pleasure. 3 cheers for you, Rob. I'm so happy to see this book published. And I just want to say to everybody out there, hello, welcome. What we have here is a remarkable and deeply immersive work of fiction based on a crime that, despite its 85-year distance from us, has a loud contemporary resonance. I was really delighted that Rob asked me to be your host tonight, having first met him in February of 2019 in the suitably dramatic surrounds of Ted Hughes' farmhouse in Heptonstall, now the HQ of the Arvon Foundation. Rob had been a winner of the Bradford Literary Festival's Northern Noir competition, organised by Amit Dand. His prize was to join the 10 other winners at Lumbank for a 4-day intensive course on writing a noir novel, hosted by Amit and myself. It was a brilliant bunch of people and a real laugh to do, and I hope that some of you Northern Noir veterans may be joining us tonight. Though I should say this wasn't the first or the last time that Rob's won awards, won the prize for his work. He's won 4 more since we last met for Hissack, Chiplet, sounds tasty, Writing Magazine and the Bedford International Writing Competition. So back then though, Rob and I, we made a pretty immediate connection, I think, because we'd both been moved to take troubling true crime stories and make fictions out of them. I read the first proof of Cuddies Strip there and was extremely moved by Rob's superbly sensitive handling of a very disturbing tale, as I'm sure you all will be. And I'm really happy he's found such a supportive publisher in Ringwood who believe in his talents as much as I do and want to give this story its voice. So Rob, as you've said, like your detective Bob Kelty in the story, you're from Crieff in Perthshire, though now you describe yourself as living in exile in East Yorkshire. And you've set quite a few fictions back in this landscape that you know and love so much. Although this story goes much back further than you do. But in the pages of the novel, you introduce us to some fantastic Scots dialect words, including that of the Cuddy Strip itself. So can you enlighten us as to what, us non-Scots, as to what the Cuddy Strip is?
Yeah, the Cuddy Strip, it's a pathway on the outskirts of Perth. It's a public right of way, so it's still there. You can still walk it today. It still looks exactly as it did in 1935. I've seen the police photographs from the crime scene. It looks exactly as it did then. So it's a public right of way. It's just to the south of Buckie Braes in Perth. Buckie Braes is just down from Cherry Bank. And it's between Buckie Braes and the Dunning Road. You have to go underneath the motorway nowadays. You have to go through the underpass and the motorway. But at one time, it was all beautifully linked in lovely rural countryside. So that's where the Cuddy Strip is. A cuddy in Scots is a horse or a pony. So my initial thought when I was doing the research for the book was that the Cuddy Strip would have been a pathway that horsemen or travelling people would have used to get about from the outskirts, moving from place to place, field to field, or town to town. When I actually went and looked at the Cuddy Strip, I wasn't quite so sure about that, because there are bits of it which are very, very narrow and very pitted and very rutted, and there are bits of it you wouldn't be able to get a horse through. And as I said, back in 1935, it was still like that. But it may be, of course, that 150, 200 years ago, it was much wider. There might not have been so many trees. So it might be that is the derivation, but nobody really knows where it comes from.
Wow, that's very interesting. It's here that we first meet Danny Kerrigan with his 17-year-old girlfriend, Marjorie Fenwick. These two courting teenagers are very much in love, but they only have a few more moments of peace and happiness left as the story begins. Perhaps you can set the scene for us now with your first reading.
Yep, certainly. So it's an August evening, as you said, in 1935. It's a full moon, so it's a lovely bright evening, even though it's getting quite late. Beautiful sunshine. It's been the hottest summer for 20 years, so it was lovely, lovely weather. Danny and Marjorie are walking in the Cuddy Strip. Basically, it's a lover's lane. It's where the young people went to get out of the prying eyes of parents and adults and so on. And so they were out having a romantic walk, a romantic evening. There's a reference in the passage I'm about to read to whins. Whins are gorse bushes. And there's also a reference to a swagger coat. A swagger coat is a long coat that's quite sharply waisted, nipped in at the waist, and obviously looks very elegant, very fashionable in the 1930s and 1940s. So the reading then, and this is the opening of the novel. So Wednesday, 14th of August, 1935, a day of terror. They sat in a triangle of plush grass at the edge of the Cuddy Strip, looking over fields of wheat that stretched towards the River Erne. In the milky blue of a late night full moon, the lights of Perth burned low. Love like a moment in time. Danny Kerrigan turned and kissed Marjorie Fenwick, inexpertly, his hand tentative on her back. She leaned into him, felt him warm and gentle. Thank you, he said. What for? This, you're right, this is much better than the pictures. Better than Shirley Temple, anyway. Shirley Temple's all right. She peered at him, pretend haughtily. I think you'll find I'm a lot more all right than Shirley Temple, Daniel Kerrigan. Danny grinned. Yes, ma'am. They kissed again, long and slow, each discovering the joy of intimacy. In the distance, the clock of Perth Academy struck 10. We'd best get back. Your mum will be starting to worry. Marjorie stood and wiped grass and moisture from the back of her swagger coat and put her hands in her pockets, hooking out an arm to allow Danny to slip his inside. They walked down the Cuddy Strip towards Perth. Trees hung low around them, beeches and silver birches, rustling in the wind as darkness settled over Strathearn. Swifts, hundreds of them, circled in the moonlight. The strip narrowed and dipped and turned, then opened out again, and they walked arm in arm, laughing into the gathering gloom. The stand of winds was so innocuous they didn't even notice it, but as they did, their lives changed forever. From behind them, the evening quiet was shattered by an explosion, and Marjorie felt a surge of air whistle past her right ear. "What?" she said. Danny turned. He didn't have time to look at her before a second detonation sounded, and he collapsed backwards. The noise of his body crashing into the earth was the most terrifying Marjorie had ever heard. He lay with his head and shoulders on the grass by the side of the path, and she knelt beside him and stared in bewilderment. There was blood on his face and on his lovely blue sweater and jacket. He stared upwards but made no movement. Marjorie heard a noise and looked up. There was a man standing over her. In a confusion, she couldn't imagine who he might be. "Stay with him," she said. "I'll get help." She started to run down the Cuddy Strip towards the stile at the bottom which led onto the path back to Bucky Braes and the outskirts of Perth. She stumbled over stones and tree roots and gasped as branches whipped against her face. She could think only of Danny, of getting help, of making sure he was okay. There were footsteps behind her and she turned and saw the man in pursuit. She speeded up and he speeded up and they ran together towards the stile. As she stepped onto it, she felt her foot being grabbed and she was pulled backwards onto the path. An arm gripped her throat and a rough hand was forced over her mouth. She could smell wood smoke, acrid and stale. Helpless, she was dragged into the undergrowth between the path and the wheat field. Brambles scratched her legs, nettles stung her. She felt something being wrapped around her wrists, and then a foul-smelling fabric was tied over her mouth. She gagged. She struggled in the darkness, trying to comprehend what was happening.
Wow, that was amazing reading, Rob. And the ordeal that Marjorie goes through this night is completely off the scale. Not only does she witness her boyfriend's murder, she is then raped by her killer. Yet you've managed to write this up in such a way that puts across all the shock and horror of it without it feeling in any way exploitative, which is a very difficult thing to do. How much did it trouble you writing this part of the story, and did it take you a long time to actually write it?
Yeah, it was a difficult bit to write. Straight away, I made up my mind it wasn't going to be graphic. I wasn't going into the details of the physical assault. I didn't want to do anything prurient like that. But I also had to be able to get across the sense of terror that this poor young woman must have felt, watching her boyfriend shot dead in front of her, being chased down a dark wood and being caught and raped. It must have been an astonishing ordeal for her, and I wanted to try and get that across. So I did think long and hard before I actually started writing it. And I actually, when I was getting ready for this event, I went back and had a look in my notebooks. When I'm writing, I write everything first of all in longhand, and then I put it onto computer. So I went back and had a look at what I wrote first off, and I was quite surprised, I've got to be honest, because it's pretty much word for word what the final version is. I don't usually do that. I'm usually someone who drafts and redrafts and redrafts and rewrites, and it's usually very different at the end from how it starts. But this one is almost identical. That's really unusual, and I think that kind of gets the sense that it was something I wanted and needed to get down and really do it as quickly as possible so that I could get on with the rest of the story.
So it came straight through you, basically. Yeah, it feels like that. And Bob Kelty, the young policeman you invented to be a first-hand witness to the case, to step in and invigilate, really, between what actually happened and your reinvention of it, so as to be our really very human guide to all of this mystery and tragedy. He's 20 years old, extremely musical, used to play football with Danny Kerrigan for Scone Thistle. Lives with his irascible old grandma, and in the eyes of some of his fellow officers is a bit of a misfit, to put it mildly. Where do you think Bob sprang from, and did he emerge fully formed?
Bob has been kind of inveigling his way into my stories for years. He just keeps popping up every time I write a story, he seems to end up in it somehow or other. He first appeared in a short story back in about 2006. It was a short story that was based on a poem by Violet Jacob, who's a poet from Angus, early 20th century poet. Is much darker than her story, though. Her story was quite romanticised. Mine was much darker. It's set in the late 1920s, so it's about 6 years or so before Cuddies Strip is set. And Bob is therefore a 13, 14-year-old boy. He's a very young lad. He's very shy, very lonely. His father is much older than the fathers of all of the other boys around. His mother's dead. She died in childbirth. So he's very lonely. He has a crush on an older girl. And she's in the same class at him at school because it's a little school, so they're all different ages in the same year. He's got a bit of a crush on her. And one evening he spends the entire afternoon with her, and nothing happens, obviously, because he's just a little boy. But he feels at the end of it, he's really grown up now. He thinks this is great. I'm a grown up man now, because I've been speaking with a girl all afternoon. But then he goes home and is confronted by a terrible tragedy, and that tragedy forms the backdrop to Cuddy Strip. So that was Bob as a young child. And he then appeared in my novel Cloudland. I mentioned Cloudland earlier. He appeared in that. That's set in 1985. So it's 50 years after Cuddy Strip, and Bob's now a 70-year-old man. He wasn't originally even in the novel. Again, he just appeared. The novel's about a group of dissolutes, I guess, and outsiders, and disconnected people. And I realized as I was writing it, I needed somebody to try and bring them all together, to add some sort of cohesion to the narrative. And that became Bob. So it's not a big role in terms of how many lines he's got, but it's a really important one because essentially he's the moral center of that novel. So I'd now written about Bob when he was a very young child, and when he was an old man. And now, when I was writing Cuddy Strip, I needed a protagonist for the novel. And it made sense yet again to look at him. So again, he started pushing himself into the story. I already had Victor Connerboy in the story. He's the police inspector, but he's aging, he's approaching retirement. He's not good at confrontation. He really wants a bit of a quiet life. He was never going to be the dynamic presence I would need to be able to solve the crime. So I needed somebody. And I really quite liked the idea of it being Bob because he's so atypical of the protagonist in a crime novel. He's still effectively traumatized by what happened in his childhood. We would say it's PTSD today. Obviously, they hadn't heard of that. He's desperately shy. He's got low self-esteem. And to be honest, he's a pretty terrible policeman. He's not very practical, but he is extremely clever. He doesn't realize it's extremely clever, but he is. And that actually makes him an excellent detective. And so it's Bob who does all of the investigative work, and it's Bob who resolves the crime. So, as I say, he's been around for a long, long time, and he just won't go away. But I don't really mind because I like him a lot. He's a nice guy.
Yeah, no, he's a good bloke to be around, and I can see why he's gotten hold of your heart. You will go on to reveal some of what you've just been talking about, the sort of the trauma of Bob's past during the course of Cuddy Strip, and we'll discover why the method of murder in this case strikes such an emotional chord with him. Let's get to know lovely Bob a bit better with this next extract, which also nicely sets up how well you depict the lynch mob mentality that spreads through the city of Perth as everyone tries to join in the search for the killer.
Yeah, there was a really febrile atmosphere in Perth at this time. The investigation lasted 2 weeks, and for that whole 2 weeks, Perth was in quite a tumult. At one point in the novel, Sergeant Strangeway says a crowd will gather to watch people tie their shoelaces at the moment. There were repeated rumours that somebody was about to be arrested, and whenever that happened, crowds, hundreds gathered at South Street outside the police station and blocked the town bridge, blocked all the traffic. They reckoned that on the weekend of Danny's funeral, 5,000 people went to the cemetery to view the grave. and the police even had to put on a guard to stop people making off with the flowers as a memento of the scene. So there was an awful lot of things happening. And this scene actually genuinely happened. It sounds remarkable, but it happened pretty much the way I describe it here. It's reported in the newspapers at the time. So I used the scene to try and build a bit of Bob's character. As I say, he's very shy, but he's got an easy manner with people, and they relate to him. Sometimes, though, that does get him into bother. So in this scene, he's been sent to Canal Street because some young boys have reported there's a peeping Tom been looking through some windows, and he's been sent to investigate. And he then meets the group of boys who reported it. So Bob fixed his helmet to his head and hurried outside the police headquarters. His secondment had lasted 4 days, and it felt much longer. This was an alien place. Strangeway's sarcasm and Braggin's aggression were wearing, and it was a relief to escape the station. By the time he arrived at Canal Lane, it was growing gloomy. The sound of children's laughter echoed in the otherwise quiet evening. A strict demarcation of the sexes was in force, the boys playing football and the girls hopscotch. Blackened tenements rose high above them. Gas lamps threw a pale pool of light across a narrow gravel road. Everywhere else slid into shadow. The air was still warm. "Are you the lads that came to the station earlier?" "Aye, sir." A short boy, scrawny, wearing thick spectacles, grinned up at him. His foot rested on a battered football. "Is the man still around?" "Nah." "He's in Charterhouse Lane," said another boy, younger, perhaps 8 or 9. He should have been in bed. He wore a dilapidated sleeveless pullover, pocked with holes, and a pair of grey ragged shorts. His socks were held up with garters that were visibly too tight. His boots were a size too large. "My sister told me," he explained. "Charterhouse Lane?" "Aye." "Have you caught the murderer yet?" "An arrest is imminent. Just you wait and watch." Bob adjusted his helmet and walked towards Charterhouse Lane. Behind him, the children scattered and ran, witnesses bearing exciting news. Bob walked through an opening into a small enclosed lane. Terraces rose above him on either side, stone stairways curling up to the first floors. Old animal buyers, some still in use, were on the ground floor. The cobbles gleamed in the yellow light of the street lamps. Bob saw the man at the far end of the lane. He did not appear sober. "What are you doing?" said Bob. "Nothing," said the man. He was in his 20s, but balding even more than Bob. His suit was probably older than him, was once blue, but was now an indeterminate dust colour. Beneath it, he wore a frayed shirt with no tie, and his shoes were scuffed and worn. He did not give the impression of possessing much in the way of brain power. "I've had reports you've been kicking through windows." "What for?" "You tell me." "I've no done a thing, constable, honest I haven't." Bob stared at him. His eyes were dull and lifeless. He stank of alcohol. "What's your name?" "Bert Quinn." "Where are you from?" Bob was aware of a hubbub behind him. He turned and saw 30 locals approaching. Behind them, another wave advanced. He looked up. People were hanging out of windows. Shouts filled the air. "Ochtermuchty," said the man. "Eh? I'm for Ochtermuchty." "What are you doing here then?" "I'm trying to get home. I was with my cousin, Joe Considine. We were in the Scott Street bar. He buggered off and left me there. I got lost looking for the bus station." Bob could barely concentrate for the noise. There were over 100 people now, perhaps nearer 200, watchful, jostling to get closer. "What's happening?" said Quinn uneasily. "I've no idea." "Look, get yourself back to Ochtermuchty as soon as you like. The bus station's this way. Follow me." They set off and the crowd parted, but immediately closed up behind them and they began to follow. "You going to arrest him, constable?" shouted a woman in a black shawl. "Nah, I'm taking him to the bus station." "Aye, right." "I am," he said, but the crowd were in no mood to be dissuaded. He saw the ragamuffin boy holding his father's hand. He saw the boy with the glasses. He replayed the earlier conversation in his head. "I never said," he said, but stopped. "Look, there's no going to be any arrests. The lot of you go home." He and Quinn walked off. The crowd followed all the way, chanting and cheering as though they were embarking on a grand social outing. They followed him up Jane Street and into Canal Street. By the time they arrived at Hospital Street, they were singing. When they reached the bus station at Leonard Street, there were hundreds of them, marching and singing in unison. People hung out of windows and cheered them on for the entirety of the procession. Sporadic fights broke out, drunks egged on by greater drunks. Funny town this, said Quinn, as he jumped on board a brown and yellow bus. He sat in the front seat and wiped condensation from the window and watched the crowd watching him. Aye, said Bob.
That's so brilliant. a good comedy moment there for Bob. There's a lot of police politics actually swirling around in this investigation. The case is taken over by Acting Constable Archibald McNaughton of the County Police. He's an old rival of Bob's mentor, Inspector Victor Connerboy. McNaughton's very much a man of action, and he places his swaggering adjutant, Detective Sergeant Braggan, the aptly named, at the head of the investigation. Connerboy, a completely different and much more liberal and tolerant character, makes sure Bob, whose intuitions and sensitive way of dealing with difficult characters is so valuable to the investigation, is seconded to work with them. County and City will remain two opposing forces throughout the investigation, and through their interactions, we get to see the macho side of policing at its worst. So how much of this is based on what really happened, Rob?
Yeah, there were two police forces at the time. There was the Perth City Force, which purely looked at the city of Perth, and there was the Perthshire County Constabulary, which covered the whole of Perthshire. But both were very small police forces. Even the Perthshire force, it only had 5 inspectors, and that covered the whole of Perthshire, which is massive. They don't call it the big county for nothing.
Right.
So they're both very small forces. Initially, the investigation was held by the city police, because that's who John Spence called on the night of the crime when Marjorie asked for help. But they quickly realised that the Cuddies Strip was outside their jurisdiction, and so it was handed over at that point to the county police force. But I think it's inevitable that there would have had to be cooperation, because there simply weren't enough men. At one stage, the Glasgow City Police were called in to offer assistance. This is probably not that unusual, but in this case, I think it was probably at the instigation of the Home Office. I think they probably insisted that this happen. They were very sensitive that a failure to resolve the crime and catch the culprit could lead to civil unrest.
Yeah.
It was a very difficult period in 1935. There were a lot of tensions nationally. There was a national government, but they were having difficulty getting decisions through Parliament. All sounds very familiar to us from last year. And there was a clear understanding that there was going to be a general election sometime very soon. It actually happened in the November of this year, but there was an awful lot of tension nationally. So the Glasgow police were called in, and I think it was probably just because the Home Office were too worried about it.
Yeah.
And I do think that's a shame, because I think the Perthshire Force did a pretty decent job in investigating the crime, but that's what they did. So looking at the officers in the story, obviously I've made all of those fictional. There were real policemen involved, and I know who they were, but I have to make them do and say things which could be controversial. I know they will still have family in the area, so I've made all of those people in the novel completely fictional. But everything else about it, I've tried to reproduce as faithfully as I can.
Right, that's totally understandable and a very good way of going about things, Rob, I think. So what separates these two factions in the book is their belief in Marjorie's veracity as a witness. This is where it starts getting really dark. Sergeant Braggan is almost immediately suspicious of Marjorie's claim to have been raped. And we're soon made aware that her ordeal on the night of the murder will not stop when the police arrive on the scene, as we will hear in this extract, where she's taken to the police station for an examination. And before you say it, Rob, I just want to warn people that there is some really unpleasant stuff in here. So if you want to turn away now, please do. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, this really is the central point of the novel. what I'm about to tell you is what happened to Marjorie on the night of the crime. But sadly for Marjorie, this is really only the start of what she has to go through. So this is the reading. Take off your clothes. It took Marjorie a moment to react to the doctor, who was busying himself with his implements without even looking at her. They were in an office at the police headquarters, and Marjorie looked at the door, wondering whether anyone might come in. Mutely, she stripped out of the clothes Mrs. Drummond had given her, all of them 2 sizes too big and smelling of stale tobacco. She sat hunched on the couch, hands gripped against her knees. There were smears of blood on her upper thighs. It was 1:30 in the morning, and she wanted to close her eyes in this nightmare and will it away. She doubted whether closing her eyes would ever be possible again. Every time she did, she was back on the Cuddies Strip, Danny by her side, and that noise, the noise of Danny's body collapsing. She knew now that he was already dead before he hit the ground. The dead weight of a body falling, that sound would never leave her. That, rather than gunshot, was the sound of death. She looked up at the man who had introduced himself gruffly as Dr. Murphy. Pardon, she said. I said, what is your age? 17. Address? 8 Long Causeway. He gripped her jaw lightly and tilted her head. She winced. Your mouth is sore? She nodded. Did he hit you? Yes. He opened her mouth and looked inside. Bit swollen, he said. Nothing serious. He inspected her body. There was 1 large bruise on the left side of her neck and 3 smaller ones on the right. Clear evidence of being grabbed by the throat, a right-handed man. He walked around and studied her back. Superficial bruises to the shoulder blades, he said. Scratches down the middle of the back. He continued the inspection, making notes in his notebook. There were multiple abrasions on both feet, 1 abrasion on the left knee, scratches on the right knee, and superficial scratches on the left thigh and buttock. You've been in the wars? Yes, sir. He pushed her onto her back and lifted her knees and pulled them apart. Her vagina was red with blood. What are you doing? Marjorie said. She recoiled as he slid 2 fingers inside her and pushed and probed. Her attacker had done the same thing 2 hours before. It hurt then and it hurt now. The sensations were the same. You're menstruating? Yes. Did he physically assault you? Yes. Sexually? Yes. Are you sure? Yes. Miss Fenwick, this is a vital question, so I'll ask it again. Are you sure? I'm sure. She turned onto her side and shut herself off from reality. She could still feel those fingers, that invasion. Come along, child, you can get dressed again now. The police will need to interview you. Tonight, of course.
Rob, from what you know from your research, was this the standard procedure a woman could expect to endure in those days?
From the evidence of this case, it does kind of seem to be that, yeah. If I can just share my screen for a moment. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what you see there, that is the actual medical report from the night, from the investigation on the night, the investigation that I've just written about. And this is an extract from it. You have to apologize, it's not totally in focus. Photography is not one of my skills, but I'll read it. So the margins of the hymen were slightly inflamed. There was no sign of bruising or tearing of the hymen. The ostium of the hymen admitted the examining forefinger with ease and without causing pain. So that's what happened on the night of the crime. And at this point, they were beginning to suspect that because of that, she wasn't a virgin already on the night of the crime. So they did another investigation the next morning, same doctor. And this is what he said on the second one. The free edges of the hymen were slightly inflamed, but there were no signs of laceration, tearing, or bruising of the hymen. The index finger was inserted into the vagina without causing pain or discomfort. And you can see it's underlined there, and there's an asterisk there. That's actually done by the trial judge, because these are his papers that are in the National Records of Scotland. So this the item that he highlighted in that report. And the authorities were still not satisfied with this. They still considered this to be an extremely important item, detail. So they ordered, 10 days later, they ordered another investigation. They brought somebody up from Glasgow University. And this is what they said 10 days later. So on instruction from the Procurator Fiscal, we, the undersigned, have today examined Marjorie Fenwick as to the condition of her private parts. We found the hymen completely ruptured, but no evidence of a recent tear. The examination of the vagina showed that 2 fingers could be freely admitted, all of which we hereby certify on soul and conscience.
On soul and conscience, indeed.
Yeah, and it's kind of difficult to know what to say about that, really.
Yeah, especially the comment without causing pain or discomfort. Yeah, I'm sure that really was the case.
Yeah.
And Marjorie, poor Marjorie, goes straight from that ordeal that you've just from your reading straight into an interview in which Bragan tries to suggest she's making up the fact she's been raped as a cover story for having previously had sex with Danny. And this is the line that McNaughton's team goes on to push all the way into the courtroom, putting the question of her virginity to her over and over again, like that's what's on trial here. The way you wrote this scene, it made me feel that I've been through this barrage with her. And this is the wellspring of your anger about the case, isn't it? And this is what made you write the book, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, what made me so angry was not only that Marjorie was put through this ordeal, but really that there was no reason for it. She was raped. The doctors agreed she was raped, but they also decided that she wasn't a virgin, and on pretty flimsy evidence, really. I mean, a broken hymen is not actually a particularly reliable indicator of a lack of virginity. So fairly flimsy evidence. But the point is, so what? Even if she wasn't, so what? It's actually irrelevant. Yet it became a major feature of the investigation and the subsequent trial. The defense brought it up, naturally enough, and it became a major feature of the trial. And the trial judge instructed the jury. He said at one point, clearly this girl has made terrible mistakes in her life, and you will have to consider the reliability of her testimony. The trial judge was a man called Lord Chief Justice Aitchison, and he's a very famous figure in Scottish legal circles. He was the first Labour Attorney General, and he's regarded, if you look at his Wikipedia page, he's regarded as being a friend of the common man. And he may well be a friend of the common man, but to my mind, he's not a friend of the common woman. And it just felt to me that Marjorie suffered enormously throughout the whole of this case and the trial. And that's why I wrote the book. Yeah,
you can say that again, Rob. And in light of, as we've alluded to before, in light of the events so far this year, we can probably feel the huge tremors of society irrevocably changing a lot more intensely now than when you first began writing this novel. You've had a financial crash, a tectonic shift in global politics, brutish dictators on the rise. Your timing is uncanny, Rob.
Yeah, when I was writing it, which is back 2017, I did feel those resonances very strongly. I was reading a lot of the contemporary newspapers at the time and getting a feeling for the way that society was back then. And the similarities really were quite extraordinary and to some extent extremely worrying. We were still in the Brexit negotiations at that time. We were in a position where foreigners were being demonized. We had a populist lunatic had just been elected in America as president. Throughout Europe and the world, even, populism, nationalism, extremism were on the rise. And since then, to be honest, it's got even worse. We've now got our own populist prime minister in this country. So things have got worse. And I'm now currently researching 1936, and the situation deteriorates from then on as well. So fascism is really taking root in Italy and in Europe. Italy are at war. In Germany, we can see the real crackdown beginning on Jews, Gypsies, Catholics, and so on. The League of Nations is beginning to show itself as pretty much impotent. in this country, we've got Mosley's British Union of Fascists beginning to exert some influence. And throughout that, despicable things were allowed to happen unchecked in Europe. The rule of law was being overridden, just trampled on. And to quite a big extent, the similarity with now, I think, is quite chilling.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yes. And talking of quite chilling, after you've set up the crime on the Cuddy Strip, you actually straight away introduce us to the killer, the psychopathic John McGuigan, although it's going to be a while before the police catch up with him. So you're using very Alfred Hitchcock suspense techniques here, ratcheting up the tension by letting us in on the dark corners of the mind of this man and showing us that he's got this admirer, Nellie Gammon, who's blissfully unaware of what she's getting herself into with him. And you're going to demonstrate just how chilling this is with your final extract.
Yeah, I decided I wasn't going to write a straight whodunit with this because the focus was largely on Marjorie and her ordeal. So I decided from the start we would know who the murderer is. Therefore, the tension has to derive from whether or not he gets caught, and he gets caught in time. So as you said, Nellie Gammon is his girlfriend. She's a maid in Aberdaggy House. She's no idea what danger she's in, although of course we do. So this is the extract. There were only two ways from Nellie Gammon's work at Aberdaggy House to her home in Cherrybank: the long way down Necessity Brae and into the village from the Glasgow Road, or the shortcut through the Cuddies Strip. Mrs. Moon, the head maid, had arranged for Geordie to pick her up that morning when news of the murder first filtered through town. But he had taken the master to Edinburgh in the afternoon, and Nellie had insisted to Mrs. Moon she could walk home alone. Now she regretted it. She half hoped the police would still be there and the route through the Cuddy Strip would be closed. The extra hour it would take her to negotiate the long way would be worth it. But as soon as she crested the hill at Woodhead of Aberdaggy Road, she could see the strip was open. She breathed heavily and tried to persuade herself it was safe. The raped girl was 17, probably just a silly lassie. Nellie was 23. She could look after herself. It was not yet 8, but the lour of the day left the strip indistinct, especially where larger trees combined to form a canopy. She stepped along the path quickly, not looking right or left, fixing her gaze on the yards in front of her. "Don't let there still be blood," she pleaded. "Don't let me see where it happened, where the boy was killed, where the girl." Wind soughed above her in the trees. Branches crackled. The grass shifted in waves. Nellie grew hyper-conscious of every sound, every movement. And then her heart lurched, her ears rang, her fingers tingled. And then she thought she heard a noise. Behind her. Was that a footstep? A breath? She hurried on. "Faster, Nellie, faster. Turn round. No, don't. What if someone's there? It's best to know. No, it isn't." She was jogging, almost running. "It's okay," she said. "It's okay. It's not. And then she knew there really was something behind her. When she speeded up, it speeded up. She slowed, it slowed. Oh, God. She started to run, stumbling instantly on a tree root, lurching forward, feeling herself topple, stagger, fall, then somehow regaining her balance. She pressed forwards. "Nell," came a voice behind her. "Nell, it's me." She recognized it and turned and gave a cry. "Oh," she said, and began to sob. "Oh, it's you." She rushed to him and folded herself into his arms. John McGuigan grinned. "I saw you from a bit ago. Knew you'd be scared coming through here alone. I've been trying to catch you, but you were running too fast, gal." She hugged him close. He allowed her, but did not reciprocate. He looked over her shoulder to the fields beyond and a distant tree, splendid in isolation, as though it were a silent observer. "I thought you was the killer," she said. He gave a low laugh. "There was nothing to be frightened of, really," he said. "You'd be okay." He was especially pleased with the way he said that. You'd be okay. They walked on and reached the stile and crossed over it, and McGuigan did not look round. There was no need. It was in his head now.
Oh, that's so scary. Those last few lines, "it was in his head now." Oh. So If there's any redemption to be taken away from this case, it's the women who bring it about. It's Victor's wife, Bella Connerboy, who herself has been traumatised by the death of their son, Tom, in the First World War. She's the chief instigator. And in helping the damaged around her, she manages to transform her own outlook as well. So the underlying message seems to me that although the fate of the world and the innocent often seems to rest in the hands of bullies and tyrants, those that they perceive as weak are often much stronger than those who seek to oppress them realise. Is that what you wanted to imply? And was it important for you to offer some kind of hope at the end of this story?
Yeah, it absolutely was. I mean, any crime story forces you to confront difficult matters, and Cuddy Strip's no exception. But I couldn't leave Marjorie with no resolution. I'm not sure she got much resolution in reality. I couldn't do that in the book. So the final scene was really important to me, to get that right. And again, I looked back at my draft of the novel to see how that looked. And that section is actually totally different. And there is now a conversation between Marjorie and Bella, the two women in the novel. That wasn't in the first draft, but it had to take place. I had to have that in to allow both of them to shake off the demons that they have and to be able to move on with their lives. And the novel didn't feel complete without that. So that had to go in. And I only hope that in the end I did them justice.
Yeah, well, I think that you did, Rob, and I think you've done them both justice tonight as well with your brilliant readings. Thank you so much for those. I can see that we have got a number of questions here, so let's try and get through them as quickly. Well, let's try and get them through them all. So the first one is from Lola Bagan, and she asks, why do you set all your writing in Perthshire? And adds, great read.
Initially, it wasn't particularly a conscious decision. And it certainly wasn't earlier when I was writing short stories. But since I've been writing novels, I've purely been setting them in Perthshire. I've been in exile. You said at the start I'm in exile. I've been in exile since 1987. So I've been away from Perthshire for a long time, but I love it, particularly the Strathearn area. I just think it's a beautiful area. And I think it probably gives me a chance maybe to connect a bit with home. But I think more than that, and I need to be careful not to start sounding a bit up myself here, and also not to be sounding like I'm comparing myself with William Faulkner, because I'm not, because he was one of the giants of the 20th century. But he created a fictional universe, which he called Yoknapatawpha County, bit of a mouthful. It was in Mississippi. It was a fictional state in Mississippi. And he even produced a map for it. That's in Absalom. And he used Yoknapatawpha County for pretty much all of his writing. So he wrote about a number of different families, principally the McCaslins, the Sutpens, the Compsons, but all set in Yoknapatawpha County. And when I read it, it just feels like it gives an extra dimension to the writing. It gives it an extra kind of verisimilitude and realism. And so what I wanted to do was recreate that. So that's why I'm making everything in Perthshire, so that it all kind of hangs together as a sort of global narrative.
Yeah, fantastic. The next one is from Anne Pettigrew. Did you speak to any rape victims in the course of your research? And she adds, I'm thinking mainly in respect of their experience of police attitude today. Good question, Anne.
I didn't, no. I didn't look at that, because I think there are quite some difficulties with police attitudes today, but I didn't look at that particularly in relation to this story. So no, I didn't.
Okay. And now Fiona Calder. Hi, Rob. I'm only a few chapters into the book and loving it. I'm enjoying the dynamic between Bob and Victor particularly. Have you thought about them becoming a crime-fighting duo in further books?
Well, yeah, probably. I said I'm researching at the moment a follow-up to Cuddy Strip, That's set in 1936. So Cuddy Strip ends in December 1935. The follow-up is going to, which is called Barossa Street, a street in Perth, where I used to park my car every day when I went to work at Sandeman Library. It's set in January 1936, starts at the day of the King's death, and it will go through to the abdication crisis later in the year. And Bob is going to be embroiled, much against his will. He is going to get embroiled in that again, and he'll be looking to Victor, his mentor, for support. So yeah, there will be certainly another one at least.
Yeah, there's definitely room for more, I'd say. So Rowan Grout asks, what authors are you inspired by, and did reading their work shape your writing of Cuddies Strip in any way?
What am I inspired by? Well, one that I'm definitely not is Cormac McCarthy. I spent 5 years doing a PhD on Cormac McCarthy, which was quite a traumatic experience, to be honest, if you've ever read him. He's got a remarkable style, very oratorical style, lots of biblical cadences and references in there, and also extremely violent. And when I first started writing Cloudland, the other novel, I found that I kept writing his style. I was writing McCarthy, not McInroy. And I think it took me 3 drafts to get him completely out of my writing in my head. So definitely not him. If I were to say who my inspirations are, the number one would be Carson McCullers. She's an absolute hero of mine. She wrote The Heart is a Lonely Hunter when she was 23. How she did that, I simply don't understand. Her understanding of human nature, I haven't got that now. She did that when she was 23. So she is just astonishing. So she's my absolute number one. Another one would be Marilyn Robinson. I absolutely adore Marilyn Robinson's writing. There's the Gilead novels. They are now a tetralogy, of course, because the 4th one is just coming out, Jack. But the one that really gets me is her first novel, standalone, which is Housekeeping. Sylvie and Ruth are just 2 of my favorite characters of all time. And my third one, I would say, is, even though she only wrote the one novel, and she's not famous for novels, is Sylvia Plath for The Bell Jar, because that novel is just immense. People, to this day, they still talk about Catcher in the Rye as being the great novel of American coming of age. And to me, it's completely and utterly shallow when you compare it to The Bell Jar. It's just horrifying, hilarious, intensely moving. And I think what all of those novelists have got in common is that they write about disconnection and the difficulty people have communicating with one another and coming together and trying to reach a compromise with life and a compromise with each other. And I guess that's probably what I'm trying to do in most of my fiction as well. So that's why they really resonate with me.
Wow, and that's interesting, isn't it, that we met in that place where
Sylvia's grave is, yeah.
Right above us. And
yeah, I went to see it.
Did you?
I did. It's not very well kept.
No, there is a man whose job, they told me at Lumbank, there's a man whose job specifically is to look after her grave. Because it gets so much attention. Anyway, I mustn't distract attention away from your viewers. So Kevin Heller is next. I'm sat watching this with my 12-year-old daughter who, with her mates, recently started playing at Bucky Braes. It's got great ropey. Yeah. I told her a little of this story a wee while back and she's obsessed with it. She even said she was going to save up for the book, but I'll let her share mine. She is wondering, where exactly is the Cuddies Strip so that she can show off her knowledge to her mates?
Well, if you go right up to the top of Bucky Braes and come back down again, you will have the motorway in front of you. There is an underpass that runs through the motorway, underneath the motorway. You come up there and you go up through a stile and you'll see a very long, narrow stretch of trees, basically. That's the Cuddy Strip. If you look at my Facebook, the main picture on my Facebook page, that is the Cuddy Strip. So that's where you go bottom of Bucky Braes, go underneath the motorway, and then it's just in front of you. It's just a long strip of trees, and it comes out at the Dunning Road. it's possibly easier even if you go up Necessity Bray and turn left onto the Dunning Road. It's quite easy to see it there and to get onto it.
So there you go. Go off and have some adventures, but I personally wouldn't be that inclined to go up there myself after reading your book. So now we go on to Daily Norton, who says, Marjorie seems to have a terrible time in the novel. Do you think things are any better today?
Yeah, I don't really. And I think this is probably the point that Anne Pettigrew was alluding to. We're in a position, we've got the lowest conviction rate for rate for rape of all time. Back in 2017-18, the conviction rate was 4.9%, I think. So 4.9% of cases were solved and went to trial and convicted. And by the next year, that had fallen to 3.3%. So 1 in 30 rape allegations actually ends in a conviction. The conviction rate for all crimes is over 9%, so it's 3 times higher. So you have to ask yourself, why is that? And it may be that women are too scared, too reluctant to report in the first place. It may be that they're not believed. It may be that cases aren't investigated rigorously enough. It may be that the threshold for going to trial is too high. It's possibly a little bit of all of those. But what I think then arises is the question of consent. And then you start getting into this grey area. It's about he said, she said, who do you believe? Do you believe him or her? And then you start getting all of these misogynistic perceptions coming out. Well, was she drunk? What was she wearing? Was she wearing a short skirt? Was she asking for it? And in that kind of climate, I think it's hardly surprising that many women just don't even report it. So the system feels broken to me. And if I'm absolutely honest, I'm not sure we're much better off now than we were back then.
No, I would agree with you there, Rob. And I think that, I think you're right, that probably women just think, I'm just going to, like Marjorie, you'll be judged on your own morals, not the person who is attacking you. And that it would just be like going through the ordeal over and over and over again, like she did. So, yeah, that's why this story resonates. Anyway, so I'm moving on now to, and I hope I'm going to say your name right, but I'm sure I'm not, Mara Kurikan. Did you enjoy doing the enormous amount of research required to write Cuddy Strip, or did it ever get overwhelming? Would you take on a research-heavy book like this again?
Yeah, I did. I'm actually a librarian by training. I haven't been a librarian for a long, long time, but that's my background. So I love doing research. And also I did the 5 years research for the PhD, which required an enormous amount of researching work. So yeah, I absolutely love doing research. And actually, it's probably the opposite. I have to try and stop myself. I have to say, right, come on, you've got enough now. Get on with it. Start writing the damn book. Yeah, I love doing the research, and I'm working on the follow-up now, the one set in 1936. So I've been in my element again. I've been on the newspaper archive website, going through all the newspapers from Perth from 1936, and I just love doing that side of it. I love it.
Yeah, I do too. So Lindsay Murphy says, the book sounds really interesting. Here's a question for you. Has writing Cuddy Strip changed you in any way? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think it possibly has. First of all, I would say I'm more confident in being able to call myself a writer. Because even when I was winning short story competitions, I still felt a bit kind of tentative about saying, oh yeah, I'm a writer. But now that I'm actually published, it's a really good feeling. And I guess it's kind of imposter syndrome, isn't it, that we all struggle against. So I think it's really helped from that. But I think more than that, I guess we all like to think we take other people into account with our actions and try and weigh up the impact on other people of what we do. And I'm not sure actually we always do that, not properly. And I think that's something that I've reflected on and thought about having written this book. So I think that's been an impact.
Yeah, that's a good question. And a final one here from Linda. If I'm going to say this wrong as well, sorry, Lynn. Lynn Agostino. Will the sequel be based on a true story or a continuation of the Cuddy Strip? And you've more or less answered this already, haven't you? But
yeah, I'll say her name for you though, because it's Linda, because it's my sister. Hi, Lynn.
Sorry.
Linda Agostino. She's my big sister.
No.
So will the sequel be based on a true story? It will be based to an extent on a true story, not one that happened in Perth, but it is another true crime which happened around about the same period. And I'm going to use that as a basis. I will be able to go off-piste a lot more with this one than the Cuddy Strip, because I wanted that to be pretty accurate. This one I've got a lot more latitude, but I'm going to use the basic crime and the basic court case that came out of that crime as the basis of the story. So thank you, Lynn.
And thank you all. I think that's all your questions now. That was brilliant as well, really good questions. And I've got a proper drink now, so I'm just gonna say cheers to you, Rob. I'm very proud of you and enjoy the rest of your evening. I'll put you back to Megan now.
Thank you both. That was absolutely brilliant. And I'd just like to say thank you to Kathy for joining us tonight, and thank you for Rob for those wonderful readings and all those brilliant answers. I think, although I felt like I already knew a lot about the book, I feel like I've definitely learned some new things. So I'm sure everyone watching at home feels the same. On behalf of Ringwood Publishing, I'd just like to thank everyone at home watching, especially everyone who asked Rob some questions tonight. Once again, if you wish to purchase a copy of Cuddy Strip, head along to the Ringwood Publishing website or to Amazon for the ebook version. There is also a link to buy on the Facebook live stream if that's where you're watching from. I would also just like to remind you that if you have enjoyed tonight's event, just to keep an eye out, because there are some other upcoming launches in the Bloody Ringwood 2020 Festival, the details of which can be found on the Ringwood website. So I think all that's left to say then is thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Cheers.
Cheers.